White cops brutally attacked a black woman right at the entrance to City Hall, not even realizing that the new mayor of Miami was standing in front of them. They thought they could quell her courage, but what happened next shocked everyone. Find out how one incident can change everything. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this from. The sun was just beginning to rise over Miami, casting a warm golden light on the city's iconic skyline. The palm trees swayed gently in the breeze, and the streets, still relatively quiet, hinted at the hustle and bustle that would soon fill the air. In a cozy yet elegant home in a serene neighborhood, a woman was already wide awake, anticipating the day ahead. Today was no ordinary day. For Amelia Carter, this was her first official day as the newly elected mayor of Miami. She had risen early, well before her alarm, not because of nerves, but because of an eagerness that coursed through her veins. This was the culmination of years of hard work, perseverance, and a relentless pursuit of justice and equality. Her election had been a significant victory, not just for her, but for many others who saw her as a symbol of hope and change. Amelia stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the cuffs of her navy blue suit, a choice that reflected her professional style and determination. She had carefully chosen her outfit, knowing that every detail would be scrutinized on this first day. She was not only the first black woman to be elected as mayor in Miami's history, but also a vocal advocate for racial equality and social justice, issues that had defined her career. Today, she was stepping into a position of power that many had doubted she could achieve, and she intended to show everyone that she belonged there. As she prepared for the day, her mind wandered to the journey that had led her to this point. Her path had not been an easy one. Raised in a working-class neighborhood, Amelia had experienced the sting of discrimination from a young age. Her parents had always encouraged her to work hard and never let anyone tell her what she could or could not achieve. It was that determination that fueled her through college, law school, and later her work in community organizing and public service. There had been countless challenges along the way. Doors slammed in her face, skeptical looks from colleagues, and outright racist comments. She had seen the worst of what society could offer, but she had also seen the resilience of people fighting for a better future. It was that fight, that passion for justice, that had driven her to run for mayor. And now, standing in her bedroom, she felt a surge of pride and determination. She was ready. The house was quiet as Amelia moved through it. Her home was a reflection of her journey, modest yet refined, filled with reminders of her past and aspirations for the future. On the walls were photographs of her family, friends, and moments from her campaign trail. Shaking hands with community members, speaking at rallies, and standing proudly on the night of her election victory. These images served as a constant reminder of why she had taken on this role. Before leaving, she took a moment to look out the window. The neighborhood was waking up. The first hints of morning light illuminated the street, and a few early risers could be seen jogging or walking their dogs. Amelia's neighborhood was peaceful, but she knew that beyond the comfort of her home, there were parts of Miami that were struggling. Communities plagued by poverty, crime, and systemic neglect. She had campaigned on a promise to bring change to these areas, to bridge the divide between Miami's affluent districts and its underserved neighborhoods. Today marked the first step toward fulfilling that promise. Amelia grabbed her bag, made sure she had her identification badge and the agenda for the day, and stepped out into the crisp morning air. Her driver was waiting by the car, a sleek black sedan that had been provided for official city business. As she approached, he opened the door with a respectful nod. "Good morning, Mayor Carter," he said with a smile. "Good morning, Jose," she replied warmly, settling into the back seat. The title still felt new, almost surreal, but it carried a weight that she embraced. She had worked hard to earn it. As the car moved through the streets of Miami, Amelia's thoughts drifted to the challenges ahead. She had an ambitious agenda planned for her first 100 days in office, focusing on affordable housing, police reform, and economic revitalization for some of the city's most neglected areas. The tasks were daunting, and she knew there would be resistance. She was prepared for that. After all, her entire career had been a fight against the status quo. The city unfolded before her as they drove, the early morning light casting long shadows over the iconic Art Deco buildings and luxury high-rises along the coastline. The contrast was stark. Miami's wealthy neighborhoods with their pristine parks and gated communities stood in sharp contrast to the rundown blocks of Little Haiti and Liberty City, where poverty and crime were daily realities. It was this divide that Amelia was determined to address. Her driver took a route that led them through some of these struggling neighborhoods, a reminder of the promises she had made to the people who lived there. She watched as children waited for school buses near graffiti-covered walls, and older residents sat on porches of houses that had seen better days. Amelia's campaign had resonated with these communities because they believed she understood their struggles, and she was determined not to let them down. As they neared the city hall, the skyline loomed larger, and Amelia could see the iconic Miami Tower in the distance, its colorful lights still faintly glowing from the night before. The streets were becoming busier now, as people hurried to work, cyclists zipped by, and vendors set up their stalls for the day. The city was coming to life, and so was the anticipation in Amelia's chest. Pulling up to the city hall, the car came to a stop near the entrance. The grand facade of the building, with its towering columns and marble steps, exuded an air of authority and history. Amelia took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. Today, she would make her mark, and nothing was going to stand in her way. At least, that's what she thought. As she stepped out of the car, she noticed 2 security guards positioned at the entrance. They were watching her with an intensity that immediately set her on edge. She adjusted her bag over her shoulder and started walking toward the entrance, her heels clicking against the stone steps. The closer she got, the more apparent it became that the guards were not simply observing her. They were preparing to intercept her. Amelia approached the guards with a confident stride, maintaining eye contact. "Good morning," she said, offering a polite smile. But the guards did not return her greeting. Instead, one of them, a tall, burly man with a stern expression, stepped directly into her path. "Excuse me, ma'am, you can't enter this way," he said, his tone laced with suspicion. Amelia's brow furrowed slightly, though she kept her voice calm. "I'm Mayor Carter. I'm here for my first official day." The guard's eyes narrowed as he looked her up and down. "I'm going to need to see some identification," he replied coldly, his hand hovering near the radio on his belt as if preparing for trouble. Amelia reached into her bag, pulling out her ID badge and holding it up for him to see. "Here is my identification," she said, keeping her voice even. The guard glanced at the badge but seemed unimpressed. "Wait here," he said, making no move to let her pass. His partner, a younger guard with an equally hard look, took a step closer, crossing his arms as if ready to back up his colleague. The atmosphere shifted. A few people entering the building began to slow down, glancing curiously at the scene unfolding at the entrance. Amelia could feel the eyes on her, a mix of curiosity and judgment. The tension in the air was palpable. This wasn't just about checking identification. It felt like a challenge, an assertion of authority over her. Amelia stood her ground, her expression firm. "There's no need for this. I'm the mayor, and I have every right to enter the building." The guard didn't budge. "You need to wait here while we verify your credentials," he said with a dismissive tone that sent a surge of anger through Amelia. He was treating her as if she were an intruder, not the elected leader of the city. As more people gathered, the guard's voice grew louder, his tone carrying a sharp edge. "Step back, ma'am. This area is restricted." He took a step forward, closing the distance between them, and Amelia could feel the hostility radiating from him. Amelia's heart began to race. She was no stranger to moments of confrontation, but the aggression in the guard's stance was unmistakable. It was not just a matter of protocol. There was something personal in his gaze, something that spoke of disdain and doubt about her very right to be there. The young guard moved to Amelia's side as if to box her in. "You heard him. Step back," he said, his voice quieter but no less threatening. Amelia took a deep breath, her eyes locking onto the older guards. "I'm not stepping back," she said, her voice steady, "and I'm not going anywhere until I'm allowed to enter this building." The situation was escalating rapidly, and Amelia knew that how she handled the next few moments would set the tone for her entire administration. The first battle of her mayorship had begun, and it was taking place on the very steps of City Hall. Amelia stood her ground as the older guard stared her down, his eyes narrowing with every second that passed. The people entering the City Hall continued to glance over at the confrontation, some stopping to watch with interest, while others merely glanced and walked on. The building, with its imposing facade and marble steps, had seen its fair share of politicians, activists, and ordinary citizens passing through its doors over the years, but this moment was different. Today, on the first day of her tenure as mayor, the gateway to the city's power seemed determined to bar her path. The older guard, still standing squarely in front of her, folded his arms across his broad chest. His partner remained at her side, his stance tense as though ready to spring into action at any moment. "Listen, ma'am," the older guard said with a dismissive tone. "You may think you can just walk in here, but I've never seen you before, and I can't let you in just because you say you're the mayor." Amelia's patience was beginning to wear thin, but she kept her composure. "As I mentioned," she said, her voice steady but with a firmer edge now, "I am Mayor Carter, and I'm here to work. This is my first day in office. You're welcome to check my credentials, but there is no need to escalate this situation." The guard glanced briefly at her ID badge again before scoffing. "Anyone can flash a badge," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "How do I know this isn't some kind of trick? You think I'm just going to take your word for it?" His voice dripped with condescension, and the younger guard, emboldened by his colleague's stance, took another step closer to Amelia, effectively boxing her in between them. The gathering crowd continued to grow, with some people whispering to each other, their expressions a mix of confusion and shock. A few recognized her, their eyes widening in disbelief as they watched the scene unfold. Yet, despite the murmurs, nobody seemed willing to intervene. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and Amelia could feel the heat rising inside her chest. She had dealt with discrimination before, but the sheer disrespect she faced now, on her first day as mayor, was hard to fathom. "I don't have time for this," Amelia said sharply, her eyes fixed on the older guard. "I was elected by the people of this city. You can call your supervisor or anyone else you need to verify who I am, but I'm not going to stand here arguing about my right to enter my own office." The older guard's expression hardened, and his voice grew more aggressive. "I told you, you're not going anywhere until we say so," he snapped, stepping even closer. "And you need to stop raising your voice at me. You're the one who needs to calm down." The comment made Amelia's blood boil. The implication that she was being irrational or unreasonable was a familiar tactic used to dismiss and diminish black women who dared to assert themselves. She could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, scrutinizing her every move. She understood that she had to be careful. Any perceived overreaction would likely be used against her later. But at the same time, backing down wasn't an option. The younger guard, noticing the way Amelia's fists clenched by her sides, spoke up. "Step back, ma'am. Now." His voice was quieter than his partner's, but there was a coldness in it that matched the older man's hostility. Amelia took a small step forward instead, her gaze piercing through the space between the two men. "Let me be absolutely clear," she said, her voice low but full of resolve. "I am not leaving. I have a job to do, and you're standing in the way of that. If you have a problem with me being here, then you're the one who's out of line." The older guard reached for his radio, clearly intending to call for backup. "If you don't step back right now, I'm going to have you removed," he said, his tone threatening. The moment was teetering on the edge of chaos, and the slightest spark could send it over. As he brought the radio to his lips, Amelia noticed a subtle but significant shift in the crowd. Some people began recording the incident on their phones, and a few onlookers started speaking up. "That's the new mayor," someone said loudly. "She's supposed to be here." Another voice chimed in. "What's going on? Why aren't they letting her in?" Amelia didn't know whether these voices would help or hinder her, but they seemed to catch the guards off guard, if only for a moment. The older guard paused with the radio in his hand, his eyes darting toward the growing crowd. His partner shot him a questioning look, as though wondering if they were indeed making a mistake. Before the guards could decide on their next move, Amelia took another bold step forward, refusing to be intimidated. "This has gone on long enough," she declared. "You will not stop me from doing my job." The older guard's face twisted with anger, and without warning, he grabbed Amelia's arm with a force that made her wince. The sudden, aggressive action took her by surprise, and the intensity of his grip sent a jolt of pain shooting through her shoulder. "I said, step back," he barked, his voice carrying an unmistakable threat. The crowd gasped in unison, and the atmosphere shifted from tense to explosive in an instant. Amelia instinctively pulled her arm free, her eyes blazing with a mix of shock and fury. She stumbled back slightly, but quickly regained her footing, her pulse pounding in her ears. The younger guard moved in closer, his posture tense as though preparing to restrain her physically. Amelia's documents slipped from her hand, scattering across the steps. The sight of her papers blowing in the breeze, abandoned on the ground, seemed to symbolize the indignity of the moment. Here she was, the elected leader of the city, being treated as though she were a threat or a criminal simply for trying to walk into her place of work. "Get your hands off me," she shouted, her voice filled with both authority and outrage. She glared at the older guard who had taken a step back but still looked defiant. "I am Mayor Carter, and if you touch me again, I will personally see to it that you face consequences." The older guard opened his mouth to retort, but a murmur ran through the crowd, an urgent whisper that seemed to ripple outward as people noticed someone approaching from the direction of the City Hall entrance. Amelia glanced over her shoulder and saw a man in a dark uniform striding purposefully toward them. His face was tight with concern as he took in the scene, and his badge indicated that he was a senior member of the security team. "Enough!" the senior guard barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. "What's going on here?" The two guards turned toward him, the older one quickly moving to explain himself. "This woman was trying to enter without proper authorization," he said, his tone defensive. "She claimed to be the mayor, but—" "She is the mayor," the senior guard interrupted, his eyes flashing with anger. He turned to Amelia, his expression softening slightly. "I'm so sorry, Mayor Carter. There seems to have been a misunderstanding." The younger guard's face turned pale, and the older guard stiffened, his jaw tightening as though trying to swallow his pride. "We were just following protocol," he muttered, but the senior guard shot him a look that could silence a room. "Step aside," the senior guard commanded. "You're dismissed. I'll handle this from here." The two guards hesitated for a moment, glancing at each other with uncertainty, but then stepped back reluctantly. Amelia brushed past them, her jaw set with determination. As she bent down to retrieve her documents, she could feel the heat of humiliation burning her cheeks, though she refused to show any sign of weakness. The senior guard bent down to help her pick up the papers, offering a quiet apology as he did. "I'm truly sorry, ma'am," he said, handing her the last of the documents. "This should never have happened." Amelia took the papers from him and nodded curtly. "You're right," she replied, her voice cold. "It shouldn't have." Straightening her back, she took a moment to look at the gathered crowd. The onlookers seemed stunned, and some still held their phones aloft, recording the aftermath of the incident. She met the eyes of a few people in the crowd, her gaze unyielding, as if daring anyone to question her right to be there. The senior guard stepped aside, gesturing towards the doors of City Hall. "Please, go right in," he said, his voice filled with regret. Amelia walked up the steps, her stride steady despite the turmoil of emotions coursing through her. As she crossed the threshold into the building, she felt a surge of determination stronger than ever before. This was not just a minor inconvenience or a misunderstanding. It was a blatant display of disrespect and prejudice that could not be ignored. She had been elected to bring change, to confront these very issues that persisted beneath the surface of polite society. And now, before even setting foot in her office, she was reminded of just how deeply rooted these problems were. But if they thought they could deter her, they were mistaken. The doors of City Hall closed behind her, and Amelia knew this was only the beginning. She would not be silenced, and she would not back down. This fight had come to her doorstep, and she was ready to face it head on. Amelia's footsteps echoed down the marble hallway of City Hall as she made her way to her office. The grand building, with its high ceilings and opulent decor, seemed to swallow the sound, creating a stark contrast to the chaotic scene that had just unfolded outside. She could still feel the sting of the guard's grip on her arm and the indignation that pulsed through her veins like a live current. Her mind raced as she walked, replaying the encounter over and over. The blatant disrespect, the outright aggression, on her first day as mayor. The irony wasn't lost on her. She reached her office, took a deep breath, and turned the handle, pushing open the door. The space was large, with a view overlooking the bustling streets below. Sunlight poured in through the tall windows, casting golden light across the polished wooden floor. Yet, despite the beauty of the room, there was a weight pressing on her chest, a reminder of the confrontation that had tainted the beginning of this important day. As Amelia set her bag down on the desk and began to settle in, her phone buzzed insistently in her pocket. It was already lighting up with notifications, texts, emails, and missed calls. Her assistant, Lydia, was the first person to appear in the doorway, her face filled with concern and anxiety. "Mayor Carter," Lydia began, her voice steady but laced with tension. "I heard about what happened outside. Are you all right?" Amelia gave a tight nod. "I'm fine," she said, though there was a slight tremor in her voice. "Just a reminder of the work ahead of us." Lydia hesitated, glancing at the open door behind her as though afraid someone might overhear. "There are already people talking about it," she said quietly. "Some of the staff and even a few reporters who were nearby. It's spreading quickly." Amelia's jaw tightened. She had expected some resistance when she took office, but not an outright challenge like this. Not so soon. "Let them talk," she replied, her voice firm. "But we're not letting this slide. I want a report on the names of those guards, and I want to know if this has happened to anyone else." Lydia nodded, relief crossing her face at the certainty in Amelia's tone. "I'll get on it right away," she said, then added, "and if you need anything—" "I'll be fine," Amelia cut in gently. "Thank you, Lydia." As her assistant left to carry out her instructions, Amelia sank into her chair and reached for her phone. There was a growing buzz of messages, but one stood out. A text from a prominent community organizer, someone she had worked with closely during her campaign. "Amelia, we heard about the incident. This is outrageous. Do you want us to get involved?" The message was supportive, but also a subtle reminder that this incident had the potential to explode beyond the confines of City Hall. If she didn't handle it carefully, it could spiral into a larger conflict, one that could consume her first days in office and overshadow the real issues she wanted to tackle. But at the same time, if she let it pass without response, she would be complicit in letting such behavior continue unchecked. This was a moment where decisions had to be made decisively and boldly. As she began drafting a response to the text, the phone rang. It was the head of security, David Ortega, whose face she recognized from previous interactions during the transition period. His tone was apologetic, but with an edge of nervousness, suggesting he was already aware of the gravity of the situation. "Mayor Carter," Ortega began, "I just wanted to personally apologize for the incident at the entrance earlier. I've already spoken with the guards involved. They didn't know who you were." Amelia's grip tightened around the phone. "And that justifies how they treated me?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. "Grabbing me, speaking to me as if I were a criminal?" There was a pause on the line, and she could hear Ortega's uneasy breath before he responded. "No, ma'am, it doesn't. I understand this was unacceptable, and we're addressing it immediately. The guards will be disciplined." "Disciplined?" Amelia interrupted. "What does that even mean, Mr. Ortega? A slap on the wrist? These are the people who are supposed to ensure the safety and security of City Hall, and yet they're the ones who turned this into a hostile situation." Ortega sighed heavily. "I assure you, we will take this seriously. I'll personally oversee the investigation into the incident." Amelia's voice dropped lower, her anger simmering just beneath the surface. "I expect a full report by the end of the day," she said, "including a history of any similar complaints. And Mr. Ortega, this isn't just about disciplining a couple of guards. It's about understanding why something like this could happen on the very steps of the city's administration. Do I make myself clear?" "Crystal clear, ma'am," Ortega replied, his voice subdued. "You'll have the report by this evening." As she hung up, Amelia could still feel the remnants of the confrontation clinging to her like a persistent fog. This was about more than just two guards who had overstepped their bounds. It was a reminder that systemic issues were deeply rooted even in the institutions meant to serve the public. It was a microcosm of the larger problems she had vowed to address. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Lydia reappeared, this time with a look of urgency. "Mayor, there's more. The news is already picking up the story. Several local outlets are running headlines about the incident at City Hall, and there are rumors that the police union is getting involved." Amelia's brow furrowed. "The police union?" "Yes," Lydia said, lowering her voice. "It seems like they're framing it as a misunderstanding or protocol being followed. They're already positioning to defend the guards." Amelia felt a surge of frustration. The strategy was clear: shift the blame onto her for not following procedures, downplay the racial aspect, and minimize the incident as a simple case of mistaken identity. But she wasn't about to let them control the narrative. "Draft a statement," Amelia said, rising from her seat. "Make it clear that this was not just a misunderstanding, and that the actions of the guards reflect a much larger issue within City Hall's culture of security. We're going to take a stand on this." Lydia nodded and left the room, leaving Amelia to her thoughts. The atmosphere had shifted again, and she could sense the hostility starting to build from different directions. The voices that had already criticized her before she even took office were now seizing the opportunity to discredit her. It was becoming clear that this incident wasn't going to be an isolated episode. It was the opening salvo in a larger battle over the direction of her leadership. Hours later, as Amelia reviewed the statement that Lydia had prepared, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a news alert. She picked up the device and saw a notification from one of the city's most prominent news channels. The headline read, "Mayor Amelia Carter faces security incident on first day. Was it just miscommunication?" The article was full of euphemisms, framing the incident as a miscommunication and unfortunate misunderstanding, carefully sidestepping the issue of racial profiling. There was even a quote from a spokesperson for the police union, stating that the guards acted according to established protocol and suggesting that the mayor's reaction was unnecessarily confrontational. Amelia's anger flared again. It was as if the real story was being suffocated by a blanket of carefully chosen words, meant to downplay the reality of what had occurred. The focus was being shifted to whether she had overreacted, rather than on the behavior of the guards who had treated her with blatant disrespect. The pattern was familiar. Discredit the person who spoke out, make it appear as though the issue wasn't significant enough to warrant attention, and protect the status quo. But Amelia had spent years fighting against this kind of obfuscation, and she wasn't about to back down now. She could already see how the narrative would play out if she let them control it. They would frame her as an angry, uncooperative black woman who had blown a minor incident out of proportion. The stakes were higher than ever. That afternoon, Amelia convened a meeting with her closest advisors and senior staff. As they gathered in the conference room, she took a moment to look at the faces around the table. Some showed concern, others a determination that mirrored her own. They were there because they believed in her vision for the city, and this incident was not going to derail that. "I'm sure you've all seen the news," she began, her voice steady. "They're trying to bury the real issue here. They're focusing on my reaction, not the behavior of the guards, and certainly not the systemic problems that allowed this to happen." The room was silent as she continued. "We're not going to let this fade away as some miscommunication. We're going to use this as an opportunity to shine a light on the deeper issues that persist within our city's institutions. This is about more than just what happened to me. This is about addressing a culture of disrespect and prejudice that runs deeper than one incident." As she spoke, she saw nods of agreement from her team. They were ready to fight alongside her. Lydia, seated closest to the head of the table, spoke up. "We should involve the community," she said. "Let's reach out to the organizations and activists who supported you during the campaign. This needs to be bigger than just a statement." Amelia nodded. "Agreed," she said. "We're going to turn this into a movement, one that they can't dismiss as easily as they're trying to dismiss me." The path ahead was becoming clear. She wasn't just going to defend herself. She was going to challenge the system that had made this possible in the first place. There was no turning back now. This was no longer just about one day at City Hall. It was about confronting a culture that needed to be dismantled. The City Hall was abuzz with the usual midday activity, but the atmosphere was different. There was an underlying current of tension that seemed to flow through the hallways, an unspoken awareness of the incident that had unfolded that morning. Word had spread quickly among staff, city officials, and even some visitors. The security guards' treatment of the new mayor wasn't just the latest gossip. It was a story that had ignited discussions about power, respect, and prejudice. Amelia sat at her desk, her mind replaying the morning's events as if on a loop. The senior guard's intervention had put an end to the immediate confrontation, but it hadn't put an end to the issue. If anything, it had only intensified her resolve. Her first day was supposed to be about meeting with key advisors, outlining her agenda, and setting the tone for her administration. Instead, it had become a stark reminder that no matter how far she had come, the obstacles she faced had not disappeared. They had merely taken on new forms. As she reviewed the documents in front of her, preparing for the afternoon meetings, her phone buzzed with yet another message. It was from David Ortega, the head of security. He was requesting a meeting to discuss the incident and the steps being taken in response. Amelia had expected this. The senior security officer knew that she would demand accountability, and it was clear he was scrambling to stay ahead of the fallout. There was a knock at the door. Lydia, her assistant, peeked in, her expression still carrying traces of concern from earlier. "Mayor Carter," she began, "Mr. Ortega is here to see you." Amelia gave a curt nod. "Show him in." A moment later, David Ortega walked into the room, his demeanor a mix of unease and forced professionalism. He was a tall man with graying hair and a serious expression, his uniform immaculate as if to emphasize his authority. As he took a seat across from Amelia, she could see that he was choosing his words carefully before he even spoke. "Mayor Carter," Ortega began, his tone deferential, "I want to extend my apologies once again for the events this morning. It should never have happened, and I assure you I'm taking this matter very seriously." Amelia's gaze remained steady, her face unreadable. "Mr. Ortega," she said slowly, "what happened this morning was not just a minor error. It was a blatant display of disrespect and an abuse of authority. I want to know exactly what steps are being taken to ensure that this doesn't happen again. Not just to me, but to anyone who walks through those doors." Ortega shifted in his seat. "We've already initiated an internal investigation into the conduct of the guards involved," he said. "Both officers are being placed on temporary leave while we review the incident." Amelia's eyes narrowed slightly. "And what does that review entail? A few meetings, some paperwork? What are you actually doing to address the root of the problem?" Ortega hesitated. "We will be conducting a series of interviews with the guards, reviewing security footage, and ensuring that all staff are reminded of the protocols for interacting with city officials," he replied, but his voice lacked conviction. It was the kind of response designed to placate rather than solve. Amelia leaned forward in her chair. "This is about more than just protocols, Mr. Ortega," she said, her voice carrying a weight that made the air feel heavier. "The behavior I encountered today is part of a larger issue, a culture of disrespect and prejudice. I want to know how you plan to address that." Ortega's jaw tightened. "We're prepared to implement additional training for all security personnel on bias and cultural sensitivity," he said, choosing his words carefully. "I understand the seriousness of the matter, and I'm committed to ensuring that this doesn't happen again." Amelia could hear the defensiveness creeping into his tone, as though he were bracing himself for a blow that hadn't yet landed. "Good," she replied, "because I'm going to be keeping a close eye on this investigation. And if I find out that this is being treated as just a misunderstanding, there will be consequences." Ortega nodded. "Understood," he said, his tone slightly subdued. As he rose to leave, Amelia's voice stopped him. "One more thing, Mr. Ortega," she said. "I want a full report on similar incidents involving security personnel at City Hall over the past 5 years. I want to know if this kind of behavior has been a pattern." Ortega's face paled slightly, but he quickly masked his reaction. "I'll have that report for you by the end of the week," he promised before leaving the room. As soon as he was gone, Amelia exhaled slowly, trying to release some of the tension that had built up inside her. The truth was, she had expected pushback from the old guard of City Hall, but not this blatantly, not so soon. The encounter with Ortega had only reinforced her suspicion that the incident was being framed as an anomaly, a mistake by a few individuals, rather than as evidence of a deeper, systemic issue. But she had dealt with this kind of deflection before, and she was prepared to go the distance. Moments after Ortega left, Lydia appeared again in the doorway. Her expression was one of barely contained urgency. "Mayor, there's someone here to see you. It's Marcus Taylor." Amelia's expression softened slightly. Marcus was not just her clerk, but also someone she had mentored over the years. He was a young black man full of ambition and drive, and she had seen in him the same fire that had fueled her own journey. "Send him in," she said. Marcus walked into the office, his face tight with concern. "Mayor Carter," he began, his tone cautious. "I heard about what happened this morning. Are you okay?" Amelia set her pen down and leaned back in her chair, releasing a slow, measured breath. "I'm fine, Marcus," she replied, though her voice betrayed the weight of the morning's events. It was just another reminder of the world we live in. Marcus shook his head, his brow furrowing. "It wasn't right. Word has already spread around the building, and people are talking about it. They saw what happened, and no one stepped in." Amelia studied him for a moment. His anger was palpable, simmering beneath the surface. She understood it well. She had been him once, filled with righteous indignation at every injustice she encountered. But years of navigating the complexities of her role had taught her to channel that fire into something more productive. Not every battle could be fought with fists or sharp words. Sometimes the most powerful response was calm, calculated action. "They didn't step in because they didn't know what to do," Amelia said softly. "People freeze when they see things like that. It's easier to pretend it isn't happening." Marcus crossed the room, frustration radiating from his every step. "But they did know what to do," he argued, his voice rising slightly. "They should have said something. They should have intervened. You're Mayor Carter, for God's sake. If they won't stand up for you, who will they stand up for?" Amelia raised an eyebrow. "It's not about who I am, Marcus," she said. That guard didn't see a mayor when he looked at me. He saw a black woman, and that's all that mattered to him. For some of those bystanders, they saw a confrontation they didn't want to be a part of. People don't stand up for others because they're afraid of what it will cost them. Marcus's expression hardened. "It's more than just fear, though, isn't it?" he said, his tone cutting through the air. "It's indifference. It's the same indifference that allows people like that guard to get away with this kind of thing every day." Amelia nodded slowly, acknowledging his point. "You're right," she said, "but the question is, what do we do about it? I've spent my whole career fighting these battles from the bench, Marcus. I've seen how deeply entrenched this system is in prejudice and injustice. But I also know that change doesn't happen overnight. We have to be strategic." Marcus sat down across from her, the fire in his eyes still burning bright. "So, what are we going to do about that guard?" he asked. "He should be held accountable for what he did." Amelia's gaze hardened, her mind already turning over the possibilities. "I've been thinking about that," she admitted. "This isn't just about what happened to me today. This is about the larger system that allows people like him to feel emboldened in their actions. It's about every black and brown person who walks into this building and wonders whether justice is really blind." Marcus leaned forward, his interest piqued. "What are you thinking?" Amelia tapped her fingers thoughtfully on her desk. "There are a few options," she said. "I could file a formal complaint. I could take it up with the police department and demand an investigation into his conduct. But I've seen how those processes work. It would take months, maybe years, and in the end they might decide it was just a misunderstanding." Marcus's lips tightened. "So, what's the alternative?" Amelia smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "The alternative," she said, "is to use the platform I've been given to make this public, to shine a light on the kind of systemic racism that still exists in places where it shouldn't." Marcus's eyes widened in realization. "You're going to make a statement, aren't you?" Amelia nodded. "I'm not just going to make a statement. I'm going to use my position, my voice, to demand change. I've worked too hard to get here, and I refuse to let someone like that guard, or anyone else, push me back into silence." Marcus's admiration for her was clear. "You're a force, Mayor Carter," he said. "They're not going to know what hit them." Amelia wasn't so sure. She knew the risks involved. To call out the system publicly meant drawing fire from powerful people who had no interest in change. It meant facing backlash, potentially even threats. But she had spent her whole life navigating obstacles. This was just one more. As the afternoon wore on, Amelia prepared herself for the meetings ahead, but her mind kept drifting back to the morning's events. This wasn't over. It was only the beginning. The morning sun hung low over Miami, casting long shadows across City Hall as the clock ticked closer to 9 a.m. It was still early, but Amelia had already made up her mind. She wasn't going to let the incident be brushed aside. The city deserved to know what had happened, and, more importantly, why it had happened. She would make a statement, one that not only addressed her experience but also illuminated the broader issues of discrimination that persisted in the very heart of the city's administration. As she sat in her office, preparing her speech, the weight of the decision she had made settled on her shoulders. Going public would be a risk. It would mean opening herself up to attacks from critics and adversaries who would seize the opportunity to frame her as a problem rather than the victim. But it would also force the city to confront a reality it had long ignored. Amelia was done allowing such incidents to fade into the background. She was going to demand accountability. "Mayor Carter," Lydia said from the doorway, her voice cutting through the silence. "The press conference is set for 10:30. We've sent out the notices and the local media is already gathering outside." Amelia looked up from her notes, her expression firm. "Good," she replied. "Thank you, Lydia. Let's make sure everything is ready." Lydia hesitated for a moment, as though wanting to say something more, but she simply nodded and left the room, leaving Amelia alone with her thoughts. The past few days had been a whirlwind. She had spent hours speaking with her advisors, gathering information about the guards involved, and reviewing policies related to City Hall security. The reports revealed what she had suspected. There had been numerous complaints over the years about aggressive behavior from some security personnel, but nothing had ever come of them. Each case had been dismissed as a miscommunication or a training issue. This time, however, she would not allow it to be reduced to such excuses. At 10:15, Amelia rose from her desk and walked toward the entrance of City Hall, where a podium had been set up for the press conference. As she neared the doors, she could hear the hum of activity on the other side. Reporters talking among themselves, camera crews setting up their equipment, and members of the public gathering to watch. The tension was palpable, but Amelia's steps were steady, her resolve unshaken. She stepped out onto the stone steps of City Hall, and the murmur of the crowd quieted as all eyes turned to her. The sun was shining brightly, casting a harsh light that made the details of the scene starkly visible. Reporters leaned forward, microphones at the ready as the cameras rolled. Amelia took her place behind the podium, adjusting the microphone to her height. Her gaze swept over the gathered crowd, a mix of reporters, city employees, and onlookers who had come to hear what she had to say. She took a breath and began. "Good morning," she said, her voice steady but carrying an unmistakable weight. "I stand before you today not just as the mayor of this great city, but as a black woman who has experienced firsthand the kind of discrimination that should have no place in our society, especially not in the halls of government." The crowd listened intently, the silence thick with anticipation. "2 days ago," Amelia continued, "I was stopped at the entrance of this very building by security guards who treated me not as a public servant elected to lead, but as a threat. I was grabbed, questioned, and humiliated in front of the people I was elected to serve. And this wasn't simply a case of mistaken identity or a misunderstanding about protocol. It was a reflection of a deeper, more pervasive issue, a culture of prejudice and disrespect that has gone unchecked for far too long." As she spoke, the cameras zoomed in on her face, capturing the intensity of her expression. Amelia wasn't simply reading from a script. Her words carried the full weight of her anger and resolve. "This incident," she continued, "is not just about what happened to me. It is about what happens to countless others who are judged, disrespected, and marginalized because of the color of their skin. This is about ensuring that City Hall is a place where every person is treated with dignity, regardless of who they are or where they come from." Amelia could see a few reporters nodding in agreement, while others scribbled notes furiously. The public response was hard to gauge from the faces in the crowd, but she could sense a shift in the air, an understanding that this was about more than just one incident. It was about a call for change. "I have instructed the head of security to conduct a thorough investigation into the actions of the guards involved," she said, her tone growing firmer, "and I will personally ensure that this investigation is carried out with the transparency and integrity that the people of this city deserve. But we won't stop there." We will be implementing mandatory training programs for all security personnel on bias and cultural sensitivity, and I will be working with community leaders to review our policies and procedures to make certain that no one else will have to experience what I did." The crowd murmured in response, some voices whispering approval while others remained cautious. Amelia didn't let herself be distracted by the mixed reactions. She knew that making a stand would inevitably draw criticism, but it would also bring about the conversations that needed to be had. As she finished her statement, a reporter in the front row raised his hand. "Mayor Carter," he began, "the police union has already issued a response, calling the incident a misunderstanding and stating that the guards acted according to protocol. What do you say to that?" Amelia's jaw tightened slightly. She had anticipated this question. "What happened to me was not a misunderstanding," she replied, her voice unwavering. "It was a display of prejudice, and if the current protocol allows for such behavior, then it is the protocol that must change. We cannot continue to dismiss incidents like this as isolated cases. The problem is not with the individuals who speak out. It is with the system that perpetuates this kind of treatment." The reporter jotted down her response, and the crowd buzzed with the quiet conversation. Another reporter quickly spoke up. "Mayor, do you think this could lead to tensions with the police union, especially with regard to future reforms?" Amelia met the reporter's gaze, her expression resolute. "I didn't take this office to avoid difficult conversations," she said. "I took this office to lead, and if that means addressing uncomfortable truths, then that is exactly what I will do. This isn't about creating tension, it's about ensuring fairness and justice for all." With that, Amelia stepped away from the podium, the press conference officially over. As she turned to walk back inside City Hall, she could feel the gravity of what she had just done. She had drawn a line in the sand, and there would be consequences, both from those who supported her and those who did not. But she had also sent a message to the people of Miami that she was prepared to fight for change, no matter how uncomfortable it might make others. Inside City Hall, Amelia headed straight for her office where Lydia was waiting. "That was powerful," Lydia said, her voice filled with admiration. "You made it clear that you're not backing down." Amelia nodded. "We've set the tone," she replied. "Now we need to keep the pressure on. I want updates on the investigation every day, and I want to start reaching out to community leaders to form a review committee for the new training programs." Lydia's fingers flew over her tablet as she took notes. "Absolutely," she said. "I'll set up the meetings." As the day went on, the ripple effects of the press conference began to take shape. News outlets picked up the story, some focusing on Amelia's powerful speech, while others speculated about the implications of the investigation. Meanwhile, social media exploded with opinions and reactions. The hashtag #JusticeAtCityHall began trending locally, with people sharing their own experiences of discrimination and offering support for the mayor. But not all the reactions were positive. Some critics accused Amelia of playing the race card, while others questioned whether the incident was being blown out of proportion. The police union doubled down on its stance, releasing a statement that reiterated the guards' adherence to protocol and accused the mayor of politicizing the incident. Amelia expected this pushback. She had prepared for it, but the speed at which the criticism mounted was dizzying. By evening, conservative commentators were calling her actions divisive, while progressive voices hailed her as a trailblazer unafraid to confront the ugly realities of institutional bias. In the midst of the mounting controversy, A call came through from Rachel Whitfield, a prominent journalist with whom Amelia had built a relationship over the years. Rachel's voice was both familiar and professional as she spoke. "Mayor Carter, I watched the press conference today," she said. "I think we need to talk. There's more to this story, and I want to help you get the truth out." Amelia felt a surge of relief. Rachel was known for her investigative reporting, especially on issues of civil rights and social justice. "I agree," Amelia replied. "Let's meet tomorrow morning. There's a lot that the public doesn't know yet, and I'm ready to make sure they hear it." Rachel's voice was resolute. "We'll make sure they know the whole story," she promised. As Amelia hung up, she leaned back in her chair and stared out the window at the city below. This was not the first time she'd faced a challenge, but it was one of the most public and personal battles of her career. The press conference had been just the beginning. The real fight was only now beginning to unfold. She was ready. The morning air felt heavy as Amelia arrived at her office the next day. The atmosphere in City Hall was charged, and she could feel the undercurrent of tension as she walked through the halls. The staff seemed busier than usual, their expressions guarded. There was no doubt that the previous day's press conference had stirred up a storm, and now everyone was bracing for the fallout. Amelia's phone buzzed constantly with notifications, messages of support, criticism, and updates on the investigation. The public reaction had been swift and polarized. While many rallied behind her, sharing their own stories of discrimination and demanding justice, others accused her of using the incident to fuel controversy. The police union had become more vocal, and several city council members had called for a closed-door meeting to discuss the implications of her public statement. As she reached her office, Lydia was already waiting at the door with a stack of papers in her hands. "Good morning, Mayor Carter," she said, her voice calm, but her expression betraying a hint of anxiety. "You've got a full schedule today. First up, the meeting with Rachel Whitfield." Amelia nodded, her mind already racing ahead to the conversation she was about to have with Rachel. "Thank you, Lydia," she said. "Let's get started." A few minutes later, Rachel Whitfield walked into Amelia's office. She was dressed in a sharp black blazer, and her expression was one of calm determination. Rachel had covered many of Amelia's past achievements, but today her presence carried a more serious tone. She took a seat across from Amelia, notebook in hand, ready to get straight to the point. "Mayor Carter," Rachel began, "I've been following the fallout from your press conference. The police union isn't backing down, and they're doubling down on their defense of the guards' actions. They're framing it as an issue of security protocol rather than racial profiling." Amelia's eyes narrowed. "I'm not surprised," she replied. "They're trying to turn this into a debate about procedures, but we know it's about much more than that. This is about a culture of discrimination that has gone unchecked for too long." Rachel's pen moved quickly over the notepad as she took notes. "I've also spoken to a few insiders at the police department," she continued. "Apparently, there's talk of releasing a statement that paints the guards as victims who were just doing their jobs. They're going to claim that you escalated the situation by refusing to comply." Amelia felt a surge of frustration. She had expected a backlash, but this level of manipulation was infuriating. "Of course they would," she said, her voice tinged with sarcasm. "It's easier for them to frame me as the aggressor than to admit there's a problem with the system." Rachel nodded, her eyes steady on Amelia's. "That's why we need to get ahead of their narrative," she said. "We need to shift the focus back to the larger issue, systemic bias in City Hall and beyond." I want to do an in-depth interview with you, something that goes beyond what was said at the press conference. We need to lay out the facts clearly and directly." Amelia considered the proposal. She had never shied away from being vocal about injustice, but this was different. This wasn't just another case to fight in court or an advocacy campaign. This was her life, her reputation, and her career on the line. But she knew that staying silent would be worse than taking the risk of speaking out. "I agree," she said, her voice firm. "Let's do the interview. But I want to make sure that it doesn't just focus on me. This isn't about one person's experience. It's about a pattern of behavior that needs to be exposed." Rachel gave a small nod, a hint of admiration in her eyes. "I wouldn't expect anything less from you, Amelia," she replied. "I'll get my team ready. We'll conduct the interview tomorrow morning and publish it by the end of the week." As Rachel left, Amelia's mind shifted to the meeting with the city council scheduled for later that day. She knew it would be a contentious gathering. Several council members had already expressed their disapproval of how she was handling the situation. They believed she was making the city look bad, stirring up division instead of fostering unity. She prepared herself for the inevitable pushback, knowing that she needed to stand her ground. Later that afternoon, Amelia entered the city council chamber, where a semicircle of council members waited for her. The room was filled with tension. The council members' faces ranged from skeptical to outright disapproving. Councilmember Peter Greer, a veteran politician known for his conservative views, was the first to speak. His tone was dripping with condescension. "Mayor Carter," he began, "we appreciate your efforts to address the concerns of our citizens, but there are growing worries that this situation is getting out of hand. Your decision to go public with this incident has brought a lot of negative attention to the city. Some of us are concerned that it's doing more harm than good." Amelia met his gaze unflinchingly. "Council Member Greer," she replied, her voice calm but resolute, "with all due respect, the harm isn't coming from my response to the incident. The harm is in the incident itself and what it represents. I was treated with hostility on the steps of City Hall, and if it can happen to the mayor, imagine what happens to the average citizen." Greer shook his head dismissively. "I'm not saying that what happened wasn't unfortunate," he said, "but the guards were just following protocol. These things happen. I think you're overreacting by turning this into a public spectacle." Amelia's temper flared, but she kept her voice level. "When discrimination happens at the doorsteps of our government, it isn't a public spectacle. It's a crisis of leadership. This city deserves better than dismissing a blatant display of bias as just following protocol. If we ignore this, we send a message that it's acceptable, that nothing will change. I will not be complicit in that." Another council member, Linda Vasquez, leaned forward, her expression more sympathetic but still cautious. "Mayor Carter," she said, "I understand where you're coming from, but there's a fear that this will create further division between the administration and the police department. If we start labeling these incidents as systemic issues, we risk alienating an important institution." Amelia turned toward Vasquez, her eyes softening slightly. "Council Member Vasquez," she began, "I'm not here to create division. I'm here to confront a reality that has been ignored for far too long. We can't fix what we don't acknowledge, and if there is resistance from any institution, that resistance itself is part of the problem." The room fell silent as her words hung in the air. Some council members shifted in their seats uncomfortably, while others glanced at each other as if waiting for someone else to speak up. Amelia could sense that, despite the pushback, some were beginning to see the merit in her argument. but Greer's expression remained hardened. "Well, I suppose you'll do what you think is best," he said curtly. "But don't be surprised if this decision comes back to haunt you." Amelia gave a small, defiant smile. "Thank you for your concern, Councilmember Greer," she replied, "but I didn't run for mayor to be haunted by decisions. I ran to make a difference." As the meeting concluded, Amelia knew that while the council was divided, the seeds of change had been planted. The conversation was now out in the open, and it would be difficult for anyone to pretend that this was simply a misunderstanding. The line had been drawn, and she had made it clear that she would not be backing down. As the day wound down, Amelia sat in her office, reflecting on the events of the past 48 hours. Her phone buzzed once more. It was Marcus. "I just saw the news," his message read. "The police union is holding a press conference tomorrow. They're going to defend the guards and say you're using the incident to push an agenda." Amelia's jaw clenched. It was a move she had anticipated, but it still stung. The police union was powerful, and their narrative would undoubtedly carry weight. She needed to be prepared to counter their claims and keep the focus on the larger issue. Just as she was about to respond to Marcus, another notification appeared on her phone. It was a news alert. "Police union to address City Hall incident, defend guards' actions." She felt a mix of dread and determination. This was about to escalate even further. "Lydia," she called out, "get the communications team together. We need to prepare for a response after the press conference tomorrow." Lydia appeared in the doorway, her face a mixture of worry and resolve. "Right away, Mayor Carter," she said. Amelia took a deep breath. She knew that tomorrow's press conference would be another turning point in this unfolding conflict. It would be the city's first real glimpse at how the police union planned to frame the incident, and more importantly, how they planned to frame her. She leaned back in her chair, her thoughts racing. She would not let them spin this narrative to protect themselves. They could call it protocol all they wanted, but she would continue to call it what it was: a failure to treat every person with dignity and respect. If the police union thought that she would quietly accept their version of events, they were gravely mistaken. This was about more than just a confrontation on the steps of City Hall. It was about justice, about making a statement that prejudice would not be tolerated, even, or especially, within the institutions that were meant to protect the public. The battle lines had been drawn, and Amelia was ready for whatever came next. The sun rose over Miami with a brilliance that belied the tension simmering below the surface. It was the day of the police union's much-anticipated press conference, and the city was on edge. For days, the story of what had happened at City Hall had dominated the news cycle, stirring debates and drawing attention to issues of discrimination and systemic bias in government institutions. Now, with the police union poised to defend the guards and cast doubt on Amelia's account, the stakes were higher than ever. Amelia arrived at City Hall early, her expression one of quiet determination. She was prepared for what lay ahead, but she knew that this day would not be easy. The police union had spent decades building its power and influence, and its leaders were experts at framing narratives in ways that protected their own. She would have to be ready to counter their message, no matter how forceful or dismissive it was. The press conference was set to take place at 11 a.m., outside the headquarters of the police union. As the time approached, reporters, city officials, and community members gathered, eager to hear the union's response to the incident that had sparked such heated debate. The union president, Richard Hall, took the podium flanked by several senior officers, including the guards involved in the original confrontation. Their presence made it clear that the union was prepared to stand firmly behind them. Hall began his statement with a measured tone, but the underlying defensiveness was unmistakable. "We are here today to address the unfortunate incident at City Hall involving our security personnel and Mayor Carter," he said. "First and foremost, I want to emphasize that the officers involved were acting in accordance with established security protocols. Their actions were based on a legitimate concern for safety, not on any form of discrimination." Amelia watched from inside City Hall, where a television screen broadcasted the press conference live. Hall's words were predictable, and she had expected nothing less than a full-throated defense of the guards. What came next, however, was a more aggressive attempt to shift blame onto her. "While we respect Mayor Carter's position and her right to raise concerns," Hall continued, "we must also recognize that there are times when public figures, in their eagerness to address important social issues, may inadvertently create conflict. We believe that Mayor Carter's decision to escalate the situation by refusing to comply with basic security measures contributed to the unfortunate outcome." Amelia felt a surge of anger at the implication that she had somehow been at fault for the guard's aggressive behavior. Hall was subtly trying to frame her as an agitator, someone who had caused a disturbance instead of simply addressing a real problem. It was a classic tactic, turning the victim into the instigator to deflect from the real issue. "We hope that moving forward," Hall said, his voice adopting a conciliatory tone, "we can focus on constructive dialogue and mutual understanding rather than casting blame. Our officers are committed to ensuring the safety of all citizens, including public officials." The press conference ended with a smattering of applause from the gathered officers, but the atmosphere was tense. Reporters immediately began peppering Hall with questions, many of which focused on whether the union would support changes to the city's security protocols. Hall dodged most of these questions, repeating that the guards had acted appropriately under the circumstances. Inside her office, Amelia took a deep breath. The union had played its hand, and now it was her turn to respond. She had anticipated this moment, and she was ready. Without hesitation, she stepped out of her office and headed to the building's media room, where her communications team had prepared for her to make a public statement of her own. Cameras flashed as she approached the podium, and the room fell silent. "Good afternoon," Amelia began, her voice calm but resolute. "I have just watched the police union's press conference, and while I appreciate their commitment to supporting their officers, I must address the misleading narrative that was presented. This is not about a refusal to comply with security measures or an overreaction on my part. It is about a pattern of behavior that reflects deeper systemic issues within our institutions." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle over the room. The guards' actions on the steps of City Hall were not simply a matter of following protocol. They were a demonstration of prejudice and a display of disrespect. To imply that I somehow caused the situation by asserting my right to enter my place of work is to ignore the real problem: a culture that tolerates bias and excuses aggression against certain people based on how they look. The reporters were leaning in now, captivated by her unyielding tone. Amelia's gaze swept over them, her voice growing stronger. "I'm not here to point fingers or to create division," she said. "I'm here to ensure that incidents like these are not dismissed as mere misunderstandings. This is about accountability, not just for the guards involved, but for the entire system that allows such behavior to go unchallenged." Amelia could feel the energy in the room shifting. Her words were resonating, and she knew it was time to push even further. In response to the union's claim that this situation was handled appropriately, she continued, I am announcing the formation of a civilian oversight committee to review all security-related policies at City Hall. This committee will include members of the community, legal experts, and civil rights advocates to ensure that we have a fair and thorough examination of our practices. The announcement took the room by surprise, and a murmur of excitement rippled through the crowd. Reporters' hands shot up with questions, but Amelia wasn't finished. Furthermore, she added, I am calling for mandatory training on bias and cultural sensitivity for all city employees, including security personnel. It is time for us to take meaningful action to address the underlying issues that have come to light. We owe it to the people of this city to ensure that every person who walks into a public building is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. The room erupted with activity as reporters shouted questions, but Amelia held up a hand to signal that she would take only a few. The first reporter asked, Mayor Carter, do you believe the union's response was an attempt to deflect from the real issue? Amelia nodded. I believe that the union is trying to protect its members, and that is understandable, she said. But protecting the integrity of our institutions should come first. The real issue is not about protocol. It's about changing a culture that has allowed these protocols to be used as a cover for discrimination. The next reporter's question was pointed. Mayor Carter, are you concerned about backlash from the police union and other city officials over your decision to form a civilian oversight committee? Amelia met the reporter's gaze without hesitation. I did not take this office to shy away from difficult conversations, she said. If there is backlash, it will only further demonstrate the need for reform. Change is never easy, but it is necessary. I am committed to making sure that Miami becomes a city where justice and fairness are more than just words. With that, Amelia concluded the press conference, turning away from the podium and walking back to her office with her head held high. As she sat down at her desk, the adrenaline began to fade, and a sense of calm washed over her. She had taken a stand, and the city had heard her. Whether or not they agreed with her, they could no longer ignore the issues she had brought to light. Over the next few weeks, Amelia's actions began to yield tangible results. The Civilian Oversight Committee was formed, drawing praise from community leaders and civil rights organizations. The committee's work led to a series of recommendations that included changes to security protocols, the implementation of bias training for city employees, and the establishment of a grievance process for complaints against City Hall personnel. The training programs began rolling out across all city departments, and soon other municipalities started to take notice. News outlets reported on the reforms being made in Miami, and Amelia was invited to speak at several forums on civil rights and public safety. Her story had become more than just an account of a confrontation at City Hall. It was a catalyst for change that resonated far beyond the city's borders. The guards who had confronted her were eventually disciplined for their actions, but Amelia made it clear that their punishment was not the end goal. The real victory lay in the changes to the system that would prevent future incidents and promote a culture of respect and fairness. Months later, Amelia found herself standing once more on the steps of City Hall. This time, the atmosphere was different. She was not there to make a statement or defend her actions. She was there to recognize the progress that had been made. As she looked out over the gathered crowd, she saw the faces of people from all walks of life. Community members, activists, city employees, standing together. It was a moment of unity, a celebration of the hard-fought changes that had brought the city closer to realizing its ideals. Amelia took a deep breath, savoring the feeling of triumph. She knew there was still much work to be done, that the fight for justice and equality was far from over. But, as she looked around, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The changes that had begun in Miami were spreading, igniting conversations in cities across the country. The battle had been difficult, and there had been moments when the cost seemed too high. But, standing there, surrounded by a city that had come together to demand better, Amelia knew it had all been worth it. She stepped up to the microphone, her voice filled with the same determination that had carried her through the darkest moments of the struggle. "Today," she said, "we are not just celebrating new policies or programs. We are celebrating the power of a community that refused to be silent. We are proving that change is possible when we stand together." The crowd erupted into applause, and Amelia felt a swell of pride. This was a new beginning, not just for Miami, but for everyone who believed in the promise of a fair and just society. And she was ready to lead them forward into that new dawn. Thank you for watching this video to the end. If you enjoyed it and want to see more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss new episodes. Click on the bell to stay up to date with all the updates. Also, check out our other videos. We're sure you'll like them. Thanks for your attention, and see you in the next issue.